So what I'm trying to do today is to try to answer, at least to some extent, some of the big questions that we have in science and in biological disciplines in general. Why are we violent, and when are we violent? What are the causes of violence, and what are the consequences? And I'm trying to do that from different angles, because as I will show you in a moment, it's very important to have a cross-disciplinary approach. These questions have been addressed and tried to answer for centuries from philosophers, scientists, artists, and researchers in many different disciplines, but have also caused a number of debates and arguments about the causes of violence and what type of methodological approaches or theoretical approaches should best explain the occurrence of violence. And you have some examples here of some quotes from very important researchers or philosophers who have tried to address the topic, and also a sample of books. These are all excellent books, but you can see by reading these quotes that there is a lot of discussion over the causes of violence. War in particular, because war, of course, is the most dramatic or evident form of violence that we have in humans. So there are quotes from Alfred Tennyson, who described nature as red in tooth and claw, because his argument was that animals are constantly fighting with one another in order to survive and reproduce. But then you have on the other extreme Margaret Mead, who was a very famous anthropologist, who was constantly arguing that warfare is not rooted in our biology, but is a cultural invention. And Douglas Fry also mentioned that violence is very often considered a prominent part of our everyday life or of human nature, because it has more dramatic effects on our lives, but it actually constitutes a very minor part of our lives. The two books at the right of the screen for you, Steven Pinker, who made the argument that violence is progressively decreasing because of our society and political institutions that allow to keep violence under control. And more recently, a year and a half ago, The Darker Angels of Our Nature was published. You can read the bottom of the main title. The goal of the book was to basically say that Pinker's argument was flawed, that there is no evidence that violence is decreasing. So how do we answer this question? How do we try to understand the very core of human nature, whether we are violent, and when we are violent, why we are violent? The first thing for me is that we have to use a cross-disciplinary approach. There are too many people on the planet who try to build walls. In science, it's very important to build bridges. We need to connect different disciplines and approaches, because cross-disciplinary work is very important. And this is very clear when you study violence, because, of course, you can focus on psychological research or work done in political science, in sociology, economics as well, and analyze how individuals behave in modern societies, when they act violently, why they act violently. You can also use a cross-cultural approach to this and investigate different violence in different communities and societies. But you will miss a very important piece of information if you only focus on modern, technologically advanced societies, because these constitute a very minor part of our evolutionary history. We have lived in state-level societies only for a few, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, less than 10,000 for sure years. The other part, the 200,000 and more years of evolution, are not accounted into an analysis of modern human societies. So you should also look at ancestral societies. Hunter-gatherers are the clear example, because they describe the type of societies that were used more frequently or for a longer period of time by humans. probably more than 200,000 years of human evolution, humans lived in hunter-gatherer societies. This is a very important type of social organization for anthropologists because they make the claim that the vast majority of the cognitive and behavioral adaptations that humans have emerged during that period when we were living in these sort of egalitarian societies where some individuals were hunting and some other individuals were gathering food, seeds, leaves, fruit, and so on. But again, you will miss some important piece of information from only looking at hunter-gatherer societies, because this is one of those areas where you need to decolonize the curriculum. Accounts of hunter-gatherer societies are mostly made by Western researchers who have a very biased view, especially in the past, who had a very biased view of how these ancestral societies functioned. And also there is an argument that you virtually have never, or researchers have never encountered a pristine hunter-gatherer societies, because in a way or another these have been affected by state-level societies. You can look, of course, at ethnography and history and elements that can be indicative of violence. Weapons is a clear, obvious choice, but also buildings that are fortified buildings. These are clearly linked to warfare, for example, but there is evidence that weapons, of course, work for hunting, but they are also very important as symbols, and the same is for fortified buildings. They may function as a signal of power that is not necessarily linked to violence. And finally, and this is really the area I'm coming from, I think it's very important to look at violence from an evolutionary point of view, and this is what I'm going to mostly do during this lecture today, because you need to look at what other species do, when and why they are violent, and when and why they are not violent, in order to understand whether humans are unique or whether there are similarities between humans and other species. And I work mostly on macaques, the species at the top right of the screen, but of course you need to have a very broad approach to these and study other species, other mammals, reptiles, birds, and ants, who, by the way, are one of the best model species or taxon for understanding warfare, because they have armies similar to humans. So how do we try to address warfare and violence from an evolutionary point of view? The first thing that we need to do is to try to understand whether propensity to be aggressive towards other individuals is emerged early in our evolution. And if we focus specifically on warfare, which I am broadly defining here as aggression and violence displayed between members of one community or group towards members of another community or group, on the basis of the fact that humans live in communities of different complexities, and non-human primates, the species that I study, mostly live in groups. Then we can analyze how violence, we can reconstruct the evolutionary history of violence. And this is what has been done recently by Gomez and colleagues, who analyzed the occurrence of violence in different groups of mammals, and analyze whether the observed amount of violence in species that are currently living, so not in the fossil records, whether is predicted by the evolutionary history that links together all these mammalian species or not. So what you see here is the blue boxes indicate groups of animals, group of mammals in particular, that for which the occurrence of violence is lower than what expected through evolution. And in red, you have groups of animals for which the level of violence is higher than what you would expect by a simply random pattern of evolution. So we don't need to focus too much on what these various groups of mammals indicate. The two most important ones for me are the Hominoidea, which is the group of mammals that contain the majority of human ancestors, and the one more relevant for what I'm going to show you in a moment is the primates, so the group of animals that contain humans, but also apes like chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, and monkeys like baboons, macaques, the groups that I study, lemurs, and so on. So the argument was made by Gomez that primates are a clear, more violent group of animals in comparison to other mammals. And this is in line with what a lot of researchers are doing, especially from anthropology. There has been a lot of work on the percentage of deaths in society that are due to war. As I said, I'm focusing mostly on war because it's the most evident form of violence. But that doesn't mean that other types of violence are not important. So here you have a graph from Keeley on the percentage of deaths that are due to war in different societies, and you will notice, without looking specifically at each society, two main things. The first one is that there is massive variation across societies. This is typical of humans. We are extremely diverse and flexible, so it's very difficult to say humans do this or that. There are societies that are very violent and those that are not very violent. And the other thing that you may notice is that the mean for state-level violence here is substantially lower than the mean for tribal warfare. So somehow suggesting that war in modern state-level societies is somehow less is having a less prominent effects on deaths than it used to do in more ancestral societies. You may say this is weird because we have in the news that humans are fighting all over the planet, especially now in Ukraine, close to us. But you need to take into account that these figures consider or control for population size. So clearly now there are more of us, and so the impact of these in terms of death is lower simply because there are more people, even though we have, of course, weapons of mass destructions that can kill thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. One of my PhD students, Samantha Wakes, we decided to do an investigation to go a little bit further into the analysis done by Gomez, because here you have violence as a single trait, and we wanted to analyze whether different types of violence are explained, at least to some extent, by evolution. So we looked at the literature, and we got data on 104 primate species, I think. So these are all the species that we have in our phylogenetic tree. So the lines that connect different species are basically a way to reconstruct the phylogenetic history of these species. So species that are closer together have been diverged more recently, and species that are connected by more ties are species that have diverged earlier in our evolution. And we analyzed 5 types of violence. In-group means aggression exchange between individuals belonging to the same group, because, as I mentioned earlier, we are focusing on species that live in stable groups. Out-group aggression is the same, but directed towards members of other groups. So these are mild forms of violence. And in terms of more lethal violence, we focus on adulticide within the group or between groups, so killing of adults by adults who belong to the same group or members of different groups. And finally, we focus on infanticide, which unfortunately is very common in humans and also in many other species. And what we found is that there is a different effect of phylogeny. So evolution in primates explain with different strength the history and the distribution of these 5 types of violence on the phylogenetic, on the evolutionary tree, okay? So intragroup adulticide and outgroup adulticide are the ones that are better explained by evolutionary analysis. So this, to me, indicates that violence is, at least to some extent, rooted in our evolutionary past. Another very important finding is that we found roughly 45% of species displaying at least one form of adulticide. And this may sound like, well, it's not a lot, it's less than half of the species, which is true. But you need to consider, when we started this study, the records for adulticide were incredibly scarce in the literature. So there were only a few species, and the majority of the accounts were on humans, of course, and chimpanzees, our closest relatives, who you may have seen the Netflix series. So they do warfare, and they do a lot of killing of individuals, at least some communities, not all of them. So this indicates this figure that we obtained by talking to other researchers, because this was mostly non-published work. This figure indicates that quite a substantial amount of species in the primate group display killing of adults. Now, there is something that I should mention when I say that evolution explains violence, because every time you make this claim that there is an evolutionary effect on violence, or actually on any other behavior, very often the message is delivered in a way as if researchers are saying that violence is inevitable. But that is not the case. And there is a lot of misunderstanding, and I think same DNA but born this way. I still don't understand exactly what it means. But the point, I think, is that if we say that violence is evolutionarily rooted in our past, it means that under specific circumstances, specific social and ecological conditions, we are likely to display violence. We are likely to display violence. It doesn't mean we are obliged to display violence. So explanations that are linked to evolutionary explanations are not deterministic, in the sense that culture and free will can still affect when and why we display violence or we don't display violence. I'm going to focus now on how non-human primates interact with one another when they are encountering another group. And I thought the best thing to do would be to show you a video by Chris, who is in the audience, on Barbary macaques in the Middle Atlas Mountains. So what you are going to see is there will be a group on the right and a group on the left, and they exchange aggression every now and then. And you also see monkeys looking around, because what they are trying to do is to see what the others in their group are doing, because they cannot move on their own, otherwise they are in trouble, as we will see in a couple of slides. Okay, you may notice that there is a lot of screaming and not a lot of actual violence, but this is quite common, although in this species you can have quite substantial injuries. So it's a very messy process. It's not as organized as you would expect, or we know warfare in humans is displayed. But the important thing is that we can use interactions between groups, especially aggressive interactions between groups, as a way to understand whether primates, species closely related to humans, have a propensity to be aggressive to individuals belonging to other groups, similarly to what we observe in humans. And in humans is a very well-known fact that at least according to Boris Johnson, that males are aggressive and females are not aggressive. And this is probably likely to be true, although there are clear differences between societies, again. We know in the movies, we always see the men fighting and the women being in the back or in the crypt, if you are a big fan of Game of Thrones. But this is not what was happening in reality. Historians tell us that especially under siege, women and children were fighting, or at least bringing food and weapons to the soldiers. So we need to remember that this perspective is based on a male bias description of what happens in our societies. So it's important to notice at the same time that in the vast majority of human societies, males do indeed are the sex that display more violence, and the same is similar in chimpanzees, one of our closest species. But again, in order to understand whether this sex difference is persistent across the primate order, we need to look at other species. And this is exactly what we did, thanks to the fact that another of my former PhD students, Laura, managed to get access to a large data set of interactions between groups in a species of monkey that lives in Indonesia. So what I'm going to show you now, and it's going to be graphic, so please look away if you don't want to see this, is a video of a monkey being killed by members of another group during an intergroup encounter. So this individual was separated by the rest of the group, surrounded by members of this other group, and they killed this individual. Ready? The individual is still in shock but alive. This one, really. Okay, so it's very graphic, and I'm sorry about that, but I think it's important to show you exactly what happens in these type of interactions. And this is incredibly interesting from a scientific point of view, because what we found is that these species follow a pattern that is very similar to what we observe in chimpanzees and what we think happened in ancestral human warfare, but the sex is swapped. So everything else you see on this table is consistent with what we found in chimpanzees and in humans. Attacks are usually massively unbalanced in favor of the attackers. This is the ancestral type of warfare, which was based on ambushes and raids. You only attack your enemy if you outnumber them. Otherwise, it's too dangerous, especially if you have to do close combat. The attackers in humans and chimpanzees are mostly adult females. In these species are mostly adult males. In these species are mostly adult females. Injuries for the attackers non-existent, and again, this is very similar to warfare in hunter-gatherer societies. If you do an ambush, you very rarely get injured unless something goes wrong. You are expecting one individual, and all of a sudden 20 show up. And it was also very much directed towards adult females. The number may not look very high, but if you include also sub-adult females, the number goes up to 80%. So it's really a female business in these species. More than 33% of attacks were resulted in severe injuries for victims. We are a little bit unsure because sometimes they run away and it's impossible to follow them. And 16% of these victims died. Now, this number, again, may not sound like a massive number, but it's comparable to the most violent communities among chimpanzees. So the claim that chimpanzees are very violent, and this explains why humans are very violent, because we are in this group of animals that are very violent, should probably be reconsidered, because my guess is that when we have long-term data from other species, and it will take a huge amount of time for that, we may discover that some of these attacks are more common. The major difference for me between chimpanzees and humans and macaques is that in chimpanzees and humans for sure, but probably also in chimpanzees, individuals form raiding parties, and they actively look for individuals from other communities. They go at the border of their territory and they search for isolated individuals. And if they find an isolated male, they attack and kill them. In macaques, probably because they lack the cognitive capacity that requires preparation of an attack and advanced planning of what is going to happen later, these attacks mostly occur by chance. They were having a fight with members of another group. All of a sudden, one individual is isolated, and they surround that individual. Once that individual is surrounded, there's no way for them to escape unless the attacking party fall asleep. Okay? Why do we observe this difference between males and females? In chimpanzees, and probably, at least to some extent, in humans, males from the same group are bonding together. They are often genetically related, and they form strong bonds with one another. So members from one community are not genetically related to members of another community, and because of that, they kill members of other communities in order to gain benefits. In chimpanzees, we know that killing members of other community results in an expansion of the territory. So it brings benefits, more food, and potentially also more mating partners. The situation is reversed in crested macaques. In this species, the females are the ones that stay in their group throughout their lives, and so they form bonds and are genetically related, or more likely to be genetically related to other females in their group. So they have a stronger drive to compete and kill females from other communities with whom they are not genetically related, and if they kill these individuals, again, they can have access to better food or more food and also mating partners. So I think this tells us that we always have to look for other species in order to really understand the biology and diversity of, in this particular case, violence. But if we move back to humans and human ancestors, we can analyze what are the possible causes of violence, especially warfare, and what are the possible benefits or costs of violence. And I'm using here an example from a study from archaeological records from Southern California, where Allen and colleagues tested whether the occurrence of sharp force trauma, so archaeological and fossil records that were indicative of violent death, were linked to two factors. The first factor on top is habitat productivity. And the second factor is more, if you like, culture-based or society-based, is political leadership. And what they found was that the occurrence of violence decreases gradually with increased habitat productivity. So the graph on top tells us that the more food there is, the less fighting takes place. The less food there is, the more fighting is needed, because individuals and groups need to fight with one another in order to access valuable resources. This is classic socio-ecological theory, and it's good that it's found in this study. On the contrary, there is no indication that political leadership is a predictor of violence. Why did they focus on political leadership? Because in human societies, and progressively more so as we move into state-level societies, leadership is very important. It's a very important predictor of whether we go to war or not. Russia, Ukraine is a very good example. It wasn't a democratic decision to go to war. The leaders decide what to do. The majority of others follow unless the leader doesn't have the strength to force the others to follow them. I'll come back to this point in a moment. But first, I want to give you some evidence on the cost and benefits of war. Because, of course, war is a very dangerous activity. If we focus on what I showed you earlier, there is space for escaping injuries. But, of course, you may make the claim that individuals are trying to fight other groups in order to gain benefits. And some of these benefits could be reproductive success, And as you can see in two different hunter-gatherers populations from South America, there is mixed evidence that fighting or being a warrior brings reproductive success benefits. In terms of costs, on the other hand, there has been a study relatively recently showing that orphans of World War I soldiers, so soldiers who died in battle during the First World War and who already had a child, these children were less likely to survive long in comparison to children born roughly at the same time, but whose father didn't die in battle. So there seems to be long-term effects of costs in this particular case of being involved in warfare. And I'll finish this part, then I'll move quickly to the last one, with a comparison. Sorry, I'll move back. As a final slide on warfare, I think it's important to mention the difference between ancestral warfare and warfare in modern societies. The major difference between ancestral societies and state-level societies, the societies we live in, is social inequality. Egalitarian hunter-gatherers shared food and had equal amount of resources. They were all working together to have access to food, and they shared food. State-level societies have more layers, more political inequality, more wealth concentrated in some individuals, and this has an effect on how individuals behave during war. And we can make a nice comparison thanks to Peter Turchi mostly, but also West Hyder, because in the Republican Rome period, there are accounts of what was happening in relation to warfare. So we know that before Rome became an empire, the richest 1% of the population only had 10 to 20% more wealth than the average Roman citizen, which you may think is a lot, but wait until you see US. And very interestingly, when Romans were fighting other armies, the chances that the leaders were dying in battle were higher than the chances for simple soldiers, meaning that there was a balance between risk and benefits. I am more powerful, so I have higher risks, but with these higher risks also come higher benefits. If we win, if we defeat Hannibal, which they didn't do at Cannae, I'm going to get a lot of wealth. So it's worth taking the risk. In our societies, and I'm taking US here as an example, but unfortunately it applies to many of our societies, there is a massive increase in inequality between the rich and the poor. And very importantly, there is a reverse balance in how likely the poor portion of the society is to face death in battle in comparison to the richest. The African American comprised 40% of total fatal of deaths during the Vietnam War, but they only accounted for 11% of the population. So this indicates that African Americans were put at the front line in Vietnam War because they were expendables, according to the leaders of the American army. And this difference is very important when we consider the consequences of war in humans. So, what does that mean in terms of effects of the risk of fighting and the risk of warfare for our everyday life and for our social behavior within and between groups? There has been an argument proposed by several different disciplines. Psychology is one of those, anthropology, evolutionary biology, economics, animal behavior, and so on, that humans have experienced a prolonged period of warfare, or at least a prolonged period of situations in which the other group was a potential threat, okay? There is mixed evidence on this, but the argument is that under these conditions, under a situation in which a member of another community is a potential enemy, these type of conditions have led to the emergence of social categorization, and a focus on group membership. So these theories with different strength and different explicit hypotheses predict that because we were facing in our evolutionary history a substantial threat from other groups, we are very sensitive and responsive to acknowledging and noticing whether individuals belong to our own group or whether they belong to other groups. This capacity to categorize individuals is important and predicts how we are going to behave. If you are part of our group or my group, we are fine. We share similar cultural norms, for example, similar interests, and we may interact friendly. If you belong to another group, we may not share similar cultural views or political views, and we may fight each other. Of course, in modern technological advanced large societies, things are different because you cannot monitor what everybody is doing. But there is an argument that this type of social categorization is still important, as I'm going to show you now. So in developmental psychology and human psychology, it's a very well-known fact that you can trigger a sensitivity to group membership very easily. In a study done by these two researchers, they just show children, this is 1 year old, 1 year and 1.5 years old children. They show them two puppets, and they first ask the child, what do you like? Do you like green beans or do you like cereals? And imagine that I say, I like cereals. Then you show these two puppets, and you ask the child which puppet they like the most, and they are going to say the majority of time, I like cereals, and they prefer to play with the puppet that has similar choices as themselves. And you may say, okay, this makes sense. I don't want to play with someone who likes green beans because they are disgusting. I don't like them. But what is interesting, it's not true, but of course. But what is interesting is that also traits that are completely meaningless, like whether the puppet turns right or left, or whether they like blue or green, triggers this type of group preference. If I like green and the puppet likes green, I consider that puppet as part of my group. If the puppet likes red, I say, no, it's someone different. So this sensitivity to very minor, sometimes non-salient traits is very common in humans and may sometimes translate into different social choices, cooperation versus aggression or prejudice. So I call the consequences of this group categorization, the good, the bad, and the ugly, following Sergio Leone's movie. So what is the good of this? The good of this is that because we are capable of categorizing individuals, we can identify individuals with whom we want to interact and act prosocially. And this is what we found with Laetitia Maréchal, a lecturer in our school, associate professor, sorry, in our school. We did a study with children where we tested whether children how much they were going to share with other members of their group in a control condition, the bluish bars, and in a between-group competition condition. So in the green bars, we just told children, there's another group, you are fighting with another group. But we didn't tell them what they were fighting over, so what the benefit of fighting was, why they were fighting, and what they would gain from outcompeting the other group. But the mere presence of another group, as you can see, triggers cooperation. So the total amount of sharing goes up as soon as the group knows that there is another group. So this is what we call parochial altruism, and it's a tendency to act prosocially towards members of our own group. We are doing a study now where we are testing cooperation within the group, but where we group children and adults in groups of different heterogeneity. So here we ask first a child, what color do you like? And I say green, and then I say, you ask the child, what type of activity do you like to do? And I say, I like bird watching. So in the condition, different color and different activity, I am with children or adults who all like different colors or different activities. Here they either differ in terms of color, preference, or activity, and here they have the same preference. So here I am really with my group. Everybody likes the color I like, and everybody likes bird watching. Good news is children don't show a difference in terms of prosociality between different groups, maybe because they are not sensitive enough when they are young to these minor forms of distinction between individuals. But in adults, we find a difference. We are more likely to cooperate, so to share resources with group members when we identify these group members to be similar to ourselves than different from us. So the presence of an out-group threat or this categorization may lead to increased cooperation within the group. But the bad news is that it may also lead to prejudice towards members of other groups on the basis of very simple traits, color, ethnicity, or on the basis of cultural traits, whether a cat says meow or a woof, or things like that. So preference for different cultural norms may lead to prejudice. And this is unfortunately a very well-known fact. Oxytocin, for example, has been proposed as the love hormone because initially we thought, when you give oxytocin, everybody starts to be prosocial. But as Robert Sapolsky mentioned here, this is very much dependent on group membership. If you give oxytocin to an individual, they will become more prosocial towards members of their own group, but they may become more aggressive or at least avoid members of other groups. This is still early days. I think there is a lot of work to do on hormones and neuroscientific evidence in support of this picture. But it's showing that we tend to discriminate quite substantially between in-group and out-group members. And here you have, I'll run through this quite quickly. This is a very example of what I just mentioned, a simulation of how police force, how likely they are to shoot when they have a black target or a white target. We don't need to go into details about whether they do better or worse, whatever better and worse means here with black or white target. But what is clear is that there is a massive difference in how they behave in this simulation depending on whether the target is a black person or a white person. And something similar happens in terms of dehumanization. So the fact that we consider members of our groups as individuals with whom we can interact means that we recognize their desires, their personality, and we can be empathic towards them. While situations that lead to extreme forms of competition with members of other groups result in the dehumanization of other individuals. As evidenced here after the Boston Marathon bombing, the dehumanization of Arabs was substantially increased after the bombing because the threat coming from the bombs automatically results in a generalization of fear towards individuals belonging to the same ethnic group. And this type of dehumanization is so much embedded in our societies that we have these even in the way we call our societies. And here are a few examples, but there are many of these. The Alemanni and the Goths, who were communities, societies, and groups that were living around the period of the Roman Empire. Alemanni, the root means the true people. The Goths means the people. The Yanomami, an hunter-gatherer society that lives in South America, means the human beings, and the Eskimos means real people. Why is that? One of the possible explanations, if you like the theory that I just presented you, is that because we consider the out group, the individual who belongs to another group, as a threat, we need something that brings us together. So if we have a group, a society, and we are the people, everyone else is not a human being, And this makes it easier for us to ignore them, not be empathic towards them, or in more extreme cases, kill and eliminate those threats. And finally, if I have 2 more minutes, sorry, I'm speaking too much, as always. And finally, the ugly. The ugly for me is that very often peaceful and aggressive behaviors are described as in opposition. We are either pro-social or we are aggressive. But the truth is that these two phenomena are often intertwined together. And there is evidence, increasing evidence, that the presence of an out-group threat and the constant facing of warfare or potential threat from other groups has led to the emergence of in-group cooperation. So we tend to be more cooperative in situations in which there is a potential threat from other groups. This is what was found by some Bowles in hunter-gatherer societies, and there is growing evidence in non-human primates. Grooming, for example, one of the most common forms of bonding in primates, and in monkeys in particular, tend to increase when a group is facing high frequency of competition from other groups. There is evidence in chimpanzees and evidence in meerkats. So the reality, as Robert Stevenson says here, is that we cannot really say humans are good or evil, because on average, of course, not all of us, but on average, we are a combination of both. Okay, so I'm finishing with this picture, which I think very much exemplifies the challenges of social interactions. Here you have 2 Barbary macaques. They are always very attracted to infants, as the one being held by one of the females, and they try to interact with one another. Being in close contact with another monkey is a sign of bonding, and they are also displaying this facial display, body display, which is often an indication of submission, but also of peaceful intentions. So they are trying to bond, but at the same time, they are facing the threat of the other individual. Being close to another individual is dangerous, especially if you look in the eyes of another individual, because in monkeys, staring at the eye of another individual is an aggressive sign. In humans, it's the same. This is why we look up or down when we are in an elevator. So they are trying to bond, but at the same time are concerned about the potential threat of prosociality. And this is, I think, a good way to finish, reminding us of the importance of prosociality, but also the potential challenge of interacting with other individuals. So I would like to thank our university, because our head of schools, past and present, has always given me, and the senior management team have always given me the freedom to explore whatever research I wanted to do. So thank you very much. I have to say a big thank you to my PhD students. Some of them are here, Richard, Chris, Letitia, because I have really been blessed with some of the best PhD students you can possibly have, and this made everything easier. I didn't have to do anything. They did the work, and I'm taking the credit. I need to thank my family, of course, because they have given me the time to explore different ideas, even when it didn't make any sense the majority of times. Moroccan and Indonesian government and colleagues for collaboration and funding. And finally, thank you very much for listening.